No one knew the secret of the uniform at the ceremony, until the police officer's respectful gesture revealed an act of heroism. Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia was far from its usual self on that reverent morning in August 1925. A thin layer of mist rose on the horizon, and the morning sun cast soft light on the white marble tombstones. A gentle breeze swayed the star-spangled banner on the flagpoles, mingling with the rustling of leaves. In the ceremony area, people in black coats and hats had formed a silent semicircle. At the front stood a police officer holding a meticulously folded, dark green military uniform in his hands. The uniform looked as if it had been stored in a trunk for years, only to be brought out into the light when the time came. The edges of the fabric were slightly worn, and dust from the years had accumulated at the seams. A faded medal hung from his chest. The metal around the edges of the medal had begun to rust, but the inscription was still legible. Above his left arm was a striking tattoo, an eagle with spread wings, beneath which was a clear, unblemished, 1944. Across from him stood a woman in a dark dress, her head slightly bowed, Ellen Carter. The lines on her face were not just from age but from the pain and pride of the past. Her lips were pressed into a tight line, but her eyes were shining differently this morning. A few steps behind her, a stern-looking general stood at attention in full uniform, saluting with his right hand to his helmet. The sunlight glinted off the epaulets on his uniform, and the medals on it shone faintly. The crowd was silent. Only a few whispers could be heard. Is this a memorial service? Or a special honor for a soldier? Amid the whispers, Thomas, a young journalist, was jotting down notes in his notebook. The pen in his hand trembled slightly, because on stage, he sensed that something beyond an ordinary ceremony was taking place. The date on the uniform, 1944, echoed in his mind. The bloodiest and most brutal days of World War II. The Normandy landing, the Ardennes offensive, the moments that determined Europe's fate. The police officer slowed his steps at the ceremony and extended the black velvet cushion holding the uniform toward Ellen. Ellen, her hands trembling slightly, couldn't take her eyes off the uniform. The texture of the fabric seemed to remind her of images from years ago. She took a deep breath and slowly reached out her hands. When the uniform settled into her hands, her fingers touched the faded metal. The cold metal felt like a silent echo from the past. At that moment, the inscription on the metal caught everyone's eye, 1944. The general's salute grew even stiffer, and a shadow of an expression trying to hide his emotions appeared on his face. The tears welling up in Ellen's eyes were about to spill down her cheek when a faint smile settled on her lips. This smile was like a silent acknowledgement of a promise made years ago, a thank you from the past. Thomas stopped writing and simply watched the scene unfold. Because the story being told here was too heavy to put into words. But the question in his mind remained. Whose uniform was this? When the ceremony ended, the crowd slowly began to disperse. Some walked silently among the gravestones, lost in their own memories, while others were still unable to shake off the weight of what had just happened. The sun was slowly rising on the horizon, casting golden reflections on the marble stones. Thomas, clutching his notebook tightly, watched Ellen Carter from a distance. The woman was still standing at her place in the ceremony, holding the uniform upright in her hands. The young journalist felt his heart beating as he took a few steps closer. "Mrs. Carter," he said in a soft but respectful tone, "that uniform. It carries such a deep history, doesn't it?" Ellen paused for a moment after the question. She raised her head slightly and looked into Thomas's eyes, then turned her attention back to the fabric in her hands. Her fingers gently traced the stitches worn by the years. "My husband's legacy," she whispered. Her voice carried both pride and a heartbreaking sadness. Thomas knew there was a much bigger story behind that answer. That night, he found himself in the cold, quiet corridors of the archives. Among the dusty shelves, boxes filled with old newspaper clippings, war reports, and military documents held the traces of time. The research that began with the words, 1944 uniform, took him not days back, but decades back. One document caught his attention in particular, a report on an operation that took place in Normandy during World War II. The text was partially censored, with some names blacked out in ink. Yet one detail remained: a lieutenant had rescued 150 soldiers under enemy fire. The report specifically noted that this officer bore an eagle tattoo on his arm. Thomas turned this information over and over in his mind. The tattoo on the sleeve of the uniform, the date on the medal, and Ellen's dignified, upright posture. Everything was slowly coming together like a picture. And in that picture, there could only be one name at the center: Lieutenant James Carter. The next day, Thomas returned to Arlington. The ceremony area was now empty, only a few visitors were praying in front of the gravestones. Ellen was holding the uniform in her lap, stroking the fabric with her fingertips. Thomas gathered all his courage and approached her. "Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "that uniform. Did your husband save a battalion in Normandy?" Ellen slowly raised her head at these words. Her eyes seemed lost in a hazy memory from years past. A slight tremor appeared on her lips, but her voice was as calm as the breeze. "Yes. But that heroism remained in the shadows for years. No medals, no official ceremonies. Only silence." Thomas, feeling a lump in his throat, asked, "Was it Lieutenant James Carter?" Ellen shook her head, holding back the tears welling up in her eyes. "He was someone who not only protected his fellow soldiers but also his humanity in the darkness of war. But when the war ended, there was no one left to tell his story." At that moment, even the wind blowing through the cemetery seemed to have stopped. A few nearby visitors, sensing the weight of the conversation, watched them silently. The air had changed. It was as if a door to the past had opened, and the footsteps of a forgotten hero had once again touched the ground. Thomas now knew, the story in his hand. After the ceremony, Thomas began to observe Ellen more closely. Every glance, every breath, the sensitivity with which she held the uniform in her hands. It was as if she were still beside her husband, in the middle of a battlefield. At that moment, Ellen was not just a widow to Thomas, she was a witness from the past, a keeper of stories. There was another person in the crowd who caught his attention, the aide to a general standing behind Ellen at the ceremony, his stern expression standing out. His uniform was spotless, his posture flawless. Thomas approached him with his journalistic instincts. "What do you know about Lieutenant Carter?" he asked without hesitation. The aide paused for a moment, fixing his eyes on Thomas. It was as if he hadn't heard that name in a long time. Then he took a deep breath. "James Carter. He was a legendary soldier. He died quietly, but his fame has never been forgotten among those who knew him." Thomas recounted what he had learned so far: the uniform, the medal, the date on it, and most importantly, the eagle tattoo. The aide's eyebrows shot up. "An eagle tattoo? Are you sure?" Thomas nodded without hesitation. The assistant spoke, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "We once heard that he single-handedly saved an operation. But the details were always missing. The records were hidden." These words ignited Thomas's curiosity like a flame. That night, he found himself once again in the dim light of the archives, among the dusty files. With each page turned, he felt as though he could hear the ticking of time. Before him lay a thick file from World War II. Inside were official reports, letters written by soldiers, blurry photographs. One document caught his attention: June 1944, Normandy. The report stated that an American battalion had suffered heavy losses under enemy fire, and communication lines had been cut. However, at a critical moment, a lieutenant named James Carter had taken a risk, charging forward, silencing enemy positions in open terrain, and saving the lives of 150 soldiers with that move. The document was written in cold military language, but the human story between the lines was clear: a muddy battlefield in the rain, deafening artillery fire, and a single man charging forward amid all the chaos. Thomas's heart was racing. He was now certain, the uniform Ellen held in her hands belonged to that hero, Lieutenant James Carter. And this was not just a memory of the war, but perhaps a legacy that needed to be remembered once again. But why now? Why had such a ceremony been organized after all these years? What was Ellen seeking at this ceremony? Did she want to carve her husband's name back into history, or was she about to reveal a truth she had kept hidden for years? Thomas, pen in hand, fixed his eyes on the silence of the cemetery. The answers to these questions were perhaps hidden in just a few words that would come from Ellen's lips. And when that moment came, he had to be there not as a journalist, but as a human being. When Thomas brought the truths he had found in the archives to the ceremony in the form of a file, the atmosphere had changed. It was no longer just a memorial service. The story of a hero emerging from the shadows of the past and into the light of day was being reborn before everyone's eyes. The participants had begun to see Ellen in a different light. She was no longer just a widow, but the life partner of a brave soldier, the bearer of a legacy. One day, an elderly man appeared, leaning on his cane as he made his way through the crowd. The weight of war was evident in his steps, and the story of years was written in his eyes. His name was Robert. As he approached the ceremony, his voice trembled. "Did you say James Carter? In 1944, he saved me." Silence fell. Everyone was listening intently to his words. Robert recounted the moment he had experienced on the shores of Normandy: rain, boots stuck in the mud, hellish artillery fire, a silence so thick you could cut it with a knife. And then, a man charging forward. "As the bullets flew over our heads, he got us out of there. If I'm still here, it's because of him," he said, his eyes misting over. This testimony changed the course of the ceremony. James Carter was no longer just a name in official reports, he was a living memory who had touched people's lives and saved them from death. A week later, a special memorial service was held at Arlington. Flags were lowered to half-mast, and James's photographs and documents from the war days were hung at the entrance to the cemetery. Ellen walked onto the stage, carefully folding her husband's uniform and carrying it in her hands. A medal shone on it. The general standing across from the stage saluted without blinking. Then the hundreds of people attending the ceremony stood in silent respect. When the applause rose, Ellen's hands trembled slightly. In the crowd, Thomas took a small note from his pocket and handed it to her. The note contained only one sentence. "The country recognizes your husband's honor." Ellen read the note, and a faint smile appeared on her lips. Her eyes were still on the uniform. "Perhaps the eagle," she said quietly, "flies here too." From that day on, James Carter was given the title, the Eagle of Normandy. The National Archives wanted to add the uniform and medal to its official collection. After a long silence, Ellen nodded. "His story is no longer just mine. It belongs to this country," she said. On Memorial Day, an elderly soldier took the podium, holding a worn photograph of the battalion James had saved. "He saved my life," he said through tears. These words broke down the walls in Ellen's heart. The tears she had held back for years flowed freely there. The ceremony did more than just honor a soldier, it brought a forgotten hero back to life. As people left the ceremony grounds, the same question echoed in their minds. Have you ever met someone like James Carter? Someone who came quietly and left quietly, but left behind the gratitude of a nation.